Hey everyone, and welcome back to Build UX. In this episode of the CRM Inbox series, we're going to start designing the message inbox. So here in Figma, let's take a look at our recreation so we can get a sense of the message inbox that we're going to start building out. Now looking at this inbox, we have a couple of distinct layout areas. So we have this header with the title and the unread counter. We have this create message action button, a drop-down filter, and then the message list with both default and active states. I think the first thing we can tackle is getting this message component established, and then from there we can go back and address the header details of this overall layout area. So clicking into our design here, it looks like the plate from the original design was around 522 pixels wide. If we reference our design particles for the spacing, we only go up to 256, but I like to keep everything on that 8 pixel scale, and I think the best width for the background of this message list is probably 512 as a good starting place. So from there, if we again look at our reference design, we can see that if this was 512, we obviously have to account for some left and right padding to determine the width of each message itself. Now, again, using our consistent spacing values, I think I want 32 pixels on the left and right. So with that in mind, we can go to our Molecules tab and start designing the message component. The first thing I'm going to do is drag out a rectangle. And as I mentioned, the message inbox will be 512 pixels wide. And we want to take out 32 pixels of padding on both the left and right, so we can subtract out 64 to account for that spacing. Now this will give us 448 for the width of the actual message. Now in terms of the height, we'll actually want to base that off of the subcomponents and the spacing of the typography that we see. So to help us reference the variations that we need, let's go ahead and grab this message active variation from that recreated design. So I'm going to copy this over and let's paste it into our Molecules tab here just for a handy reference. Now, if we open up these layers, it looks like we originally had a 32 pixel corner radius. So let's get that matched over as well. All right, with that border radius applied, let's go ahead and get the gradient that we're looking for with this dark theme. So I'm going to open up our fill panel here and let's change the fill type to linear. We'll drag out the angle of the gradient to match the corners of our component here. And we're going to need to sample some swatches. So I'm going to drag out a few swatches here so we can sample the gradient stops that we're looking for. So on this first one, let's apply elevation 1 background start for the dark theme. And let's do the same for elevation 1 background end. With those selected, we can grab our gradient and let's color sample the start and end points. And with that sampled, we can actually add this as a color style so that way it's maintained in one spot. So we can call this elevation 1 gradient, and this will be for the dark theme. Now I'm going to change these swatches over to the corresponding light theme variations for both the start and end points. And with that, we can detach this style and we'll sample the start and end points. And let's create another color style. This one will be elevation 1 gradient for the light theme. I'm going to drag these color styles to follow the start and end points for that specific elevation. And now everything is ready for use. So really quickly, I'm going to swap this back over to the dark theme. We'll focus on creating this message component first and then retheming for the light UI. So looking at our reference design here, we know we need an avatar component in the top left. Let's make sure we rearrange these layers real quick. I'm going to call this rectangle the message active plate. And we can actually componentize this right away using Control Command plus Alt Option and K. And let's rename this component to be message active. And that way we can quickly bring in some subcomponents and also establish a layout grid right out the gate. So let's grab that large avatar component. I'm going to use Alt or Option and 2 to go over to the Assets panel. Let's go into our Avatar's Dark drop down and grab the large size here. Now using Alt or Option +1, we can return to our layers, make sure that's in the correct position. And I know I want consistent padding around this component, so let's get that established. So let's do 32 pixels of spacing on all sides, and selecting the component layer, we can actually add a layout grid to help us with this. So let's add a column layout. We're only going to have one column. In terms of the color, let's use our local color that we've been using for these grids. We'll keep it on stretch, and the margin will be 32, but the gutter will be 0. I'm going to copy this and paste it to duplicate that layout grid. And all we need to do is change this to rows. And now we have top, right, bottom, and left padding all established on this component. So we can take that and zoom in, make sure that our avatar is aligned as needed. The constraints on this avatar component should be set to left and top. Let's keep making our way through the different subcomponents of this message. So we have the sender name, the subject line, an attachment icon if there are attachments, and this timestamp. Followed by this kind of header section, we obviously have a preview of the message body. So the first thing I want to do is hit T and click once to create point text. And let's type out Dribbble team so that way we can work on the message sender. So with this text selected, I want to grab our title 3 text style. I think that's the closest match. Yep, that looks good. And then we're also going to apply a medium contrast fill for the dark theme. I want this to be 16 pixels away from our avatar component. And it looks like these header contents are all vertically centered as a group with the avatar. So once we get our subject line and these other details in place, we can vertically center that group with this 48 pixel tall avatar that we have. Next up, let's get the subject line in place. So what does it say here? How are you getting on? And I think I want this to be the title 2 type spec. And we know we want it to be the high contrast color. Getting this aligned with our avatar component. I think we don't want any vertical spacing between these two typographic elements. Next up, we have our attachment icon, which we can grab from our assets panel. So Alt or Option and 2. Let's go down to our icons as part of the atoms and look for the attachment icon. Now here we don't need an attachment button because this is merely a visual representation that there are attachments for this message, but it's not interactive itself. So I think I want this to snap to the top of this layout grid. And the left and right spacing, I think we'll have to base off of the timestamp once we get that established. So now's a good time actually to think through the timestamp as its own component, because it looks like we'll definitely have different lengths of time and text inside of this pill shape. So we want a layout grid to help control the width and the text alignment. So I'm going to copy out just the timestamp from our recreated design here. And let's make sure that this is outside of any other frame. Now, in terms of sizing, I think 20 pixels is an okay height. We want to make sure that we have consistent left and right padding around this text box. So I'm going to pop open this timestamp, and let's just rename this group to just be timestamp as a standalone name. Looking at the elements of this timestamp, let's select this text. We don't have any type style applied. We also need to address the colors. Looking at our particles, let's look for an appropriate type spec that would match our use case. So it looks like body small goes down to 14 pixels. Jumping back here, we need something around 12 pixels tall. I think 14 will just look too large in this use case, so we actually might want to create a new type spec here. So we can keep it 12 pixels tall, but let's change this to be 16 pixels in line height, just so we have a line height that still is on our 8 pixel grid. So we can get this added as a text style now. So let's call it body micro and drag it into place in our text style layers here. Going over to our particles page, let's update our documentation for typography real quick. So we can drag this text input down. Body small, we can duplicate directly. Make sure our layers are rearranged as needed. Let's update this text to say body micro. It's 12 pixels font size with 16 pixel line height. And let's make sure the type spec is applied directly. All right, so with that new text style added, we can go back to our message and work on our timestamp here. So body micro is already applied. I think we'll want to apply the medium contrast to this typography. Now, looking at the timestamp plate, we need to apply a swatch to that. I think because this sits on top of elevation 1, we want to go up to elevation 2 background start. That's looking good. Last thing here is let's componentize this. I used Control or Command plus Alt or Option and K. And let's go ahead and add a layout grid here. So we're going to have column layout, 1 column. Let's use that green. The margin, I think we want to be 8 pixels and 0 gutter. And with our text layer selected, we want this to scale with the left and right and be pinned to the vertical center. In terms of our plate, we want that to also have the same constraints of left and right and vertical center. And now, as we adjust the width of this component, let's make sure that our text is text-align centered as well. And that the frame sizing is resized to fit. So in the advanced type panel here, we can change resizing to fixed size. And this will help ensure that the text has to wrap to a new line if there's not enough available width, which is a really handy visual cue to indicate that there's not enough width for the padding that we're looking for. But I have to adjust this manually the first couple times. And let's resize this frame to fit until it perfectly matches the left and right padding. And now if we update the text to be any length, we just have to adjust the width of the component itself, and the text frame will grow and shrink as needed. One last thing here, I think the weight of medium is overkill for this use case, so I'm going to go into our body micro type spec and bump that down to regular. It looks like that affected the width of our text frame, so just nudging that 1 pixel using Control or Command and the left arrow, and then getting our text frame resized. We can move this over 1 pixel. And now everything is all finalized. It looks like our body micro already updated here, so we're all set in terms of our particles documentation. And now we have this timestamp component. Let's also rename it to indicate that it's for the dark theme. I'm going to drag a frame around this called timestamps dark. And let's apply the main background color. This is just consistent with our other component documentation, so let's get everything spaced as needed. And while we're here, let's go ahead and make a light variation. So that way we have all of these smaller components ready for when we retheme the message component. So we'll change main background to light, rename the frame so that light is part of the naming. And let's think through the styling of this timestamp component for this use case. So with our original reference designs, we actually don't have a good example of what that timestamp or pill component should look like. So I think we'll have to come up with something on our own that still reads well and has the right amount of visual affordance. So the first thing we can do here is I think we're able to swap medium contrast dark to the white theme. And on the plate side of things, if we change this to elevation background to start, you notice that you can't really see anything because the elevation gradients start with pure white for the white theme. So I think what we can do here instead is actually apply a stroke to this timestamp plate. And let's use that component guide light color. I think I'll like that much more. So that way it doesn't have a whole lot of heavy weight to it. We could have reused the timestamp dark directly on a light theme, but I think that's too heavy looking. So by adding this border, we still get the sense of the pill shape. We still establish some visual confines for the timestamp text itself, but everything looks nice and light. With that styling taken care of, let's componentize this and rename it for the light theme. And we can actually take these two frames and move them to our atoms page. So let's grab these frames and get them positioned correctly in our documentation. And now we'll be able to reuse it directly inside of our message component. So going over to the Assets tab, in our Atoms heading, we have timestamps dark. Let's grab one of those, get it positioned as needed, and rearrange our layers so that everything is nice and tidy. So I'm going to rename these text layers to be the message sender and also the message subject. And with this timestamp component already right aligned to that edge as needed, I think I want to vertically align it with the paperclip icon so we can get those vertically centered. That's looking good. And let's set the spacing between them to be 8 pixels. So we may have to bump these over a couple pixels so that alignment with the right edge hits where it needs to. Now with both the timestamp dark and this icon, we want their constraints to be set to the right and top of the component. Lastly, we need to update the fill color of this to have less contrast. So let's go in and select the icon, and let's change it from high contrast to medium contrast. And that just sits better in our design here. Now, one last thing I think I'd like to do is grab the subject and sender. Let's group these temporarily and select the avatar. We can vertically center the typography with the avatar component. We can remove this group using Control Command and Shift G. And I think I'd like to group all of these subcomponents as the message header. All right, so one last thing here, looking at the elements of this message component, we need to get this preview text in place. So I'm going to grab this text and copy it out. And inside of our component, let's drag out a paragraph text frame that goes all the way to the right edge, paste this text in, and apply a medium contrast fill, as well as one of our text styles. So body default is quite large. I think we're going to use that for the actual full message. So maybe we want to bump this down to body small. That's looking much better there. Now to figure out the width, I want it to left align with the typography above. So that's looking good. And it looks like we want the message preview to only go to 2 lines. So I might have to delete some characters here just to get it to fit. All right, so just 1 character shy of working there. I'm going to go to this advanced type panel and set it to grow vertically as needed, but I want to be able to resize it so there's no extra spacing. All right, so we can drag this down in our layers panel. Let's rename this to be the message preview. And in terms of vertical spacing, let's have it be 16 pixels from this header. All right, lastly, our constraints should be set to the left and right, as well as the top of our component. It's looking good. And the last thing we can do is adjust the height of our component so that it neatly has the correct padding. Looks like we hit it dead on with a plate height of 168. All right, so with all those details in place, I don't think we'll need this reference design anymore. The active variation of this component is already taken care of, so let's just reference what the default message looks like. So the default message just doesn't have that active background. And then we also see another variation where if the message is unread, we show a notification dot on the avatar. So for the default state, we'll be able to simply turn off this active plate. Let's really quickly get a variation of our avatar here where we can toggle on that notification dot. So let's go over to our assets pane. And I think we'll want the large variation here. I'll have to reference our design once more to see what positioning we're going after. So it looks like we want it to basically align with the top and right edges, so there's some overlap with the border of our avatar. So let's zoom in here and get that spacing established. That's looking good. We can simply rearrange these layers to make sure it sits on top of our avatar and turn it off by default. Okay, cool. So we have our active variation. Let's drag out another instance here and simply turn off that bottom plate. And we can componentize this to be message default. Now this is hard to see, so let's put a frame around these two components and drag this frame to the bottom of our layers panel, renaming this to be messages dark. The frame, let's apply a background color of main background, and let's get things spaced as needed. So the vertical spacing is 32. We want it to be 32 off the top and left. And then we'll drag our frame to match the exact dimensions of these components. And using Control Command plus Shift, we're going to use the right arrow key 4 times and the bottom arrow key 4 times to set 32 pixels padding around these components. Now keep in mind, in my settings up here in the menu, under Preferences, my nudge amount is set to 8. So if you have it set to 10 by default, obviously you'll need to adjust the width accordingly. So with our documentation all cleaned up here, that addresses the single message component. So let's quickly drag out a copy of this frame and retheme it for the light theme. So messages light is the name of the frame. And then let's go into our active variation here and update the colors as needed. So first thing, the notification dot. Let's swap that to be the notification dot light variation, and it's still the large size. We'll turn that off by default. The avatar component, let's swap that out for the light variation as well. For the message sender, let's grab medium contrast light. The subject is high contrast light. This paperclip icon, we want that to be medium contrast light. And then the timestamp component, we can actually swap directly to the dark instance here. Timestamps light, that's looking good. The message preview will be medium contrast. And lastly, the plate, we have elevation 1 gradient for the white theme. With that out of the way, we can actually remove this default copy because we'll want to recomponentize the message active variation for the light theme. And we actually need to indicate the theme in the component name. So let's go into our messages dark and do the same here. So I'm selecting both of these, Control Command R to bring up the rename panel. Let's match the / to be replaced with /dark. And now we have our theme reflected in the naming. So we'll drag out a copy of this component. And the only thing we need to do is disable that plate background. Componentize this. Let's call this the default variation. And on our frame, let's make sure we have main background light. All right, so these are looking pretty good. I think one thing we need to do to finish this out is for the active variations, we actually need to bring in some sort of box shadow to help offset them in terms of being elevated above the rest of the UI. So looking at our effect styles, we haven't created a box shadow dedicated for this use case yet. So let's go ahead and get one added and we can reuse it across our UI. So let's select our active variation for the dark theme. We'll grab our plate and we want to add an effect for a drop shadow. Now it'll be a little bit hard to see here, so we may have to tweak this a little bit, but I think I want a pretty large blur, maybe something between 24 or 32 pixels of blur. The Y, I actually like that offset at 4, so I think we can keep that. And then the specific color here, we may want to tweak it to meet our needs. So I'm going to drag out a quick swatch here. And let's apply that main background color so we have something to compare to. So if we take a look at the HSL values underneath here, we have 234 as the hue, 12% saturation, and 23% lightness. So let's use that as a base for creating our box shadow that still falls along that same color value scale. So clicking on our plate once more, open up this drop shadow. Let's open up this color menu. I know I want 234 for the hue. And if I remember correctly, we had 12% saturation. Obviously right now this is pure black because the lightness is set to 0. So let's maybe nudge this up just a little bit where the box shadow is still noticeable, but isn't too strong. So zooming out a bit, let's disable these layout grids to get a better view by using Control-Shift-4 on Windows or Control-Shift-G on Mac. All right, so I think this is actually looking good. I'm going to temporarily apply the component background instead, since that's what we'll have in the message list. And I think I overall like this box shadow. We can always tweak this further. So undoing that background change, let's go ahead and get this drop shadow added as an effect style. So we can call this elevation 1 dark, and we'll be able to reuse that as needed. Now taking a look at our light theme variation, this is obviously a little too overpowering. If we zoom out, we get a really strong box shadow. I think the overall aesthetic of this app is for a little more subtlety across the board. So if we open up the layers for the active variation in our light theme, let's again select that plate. I want to detach this existing effect style. And I think we have too much blur, so I'm going to knock this down to 16 pixels, I think. This is looking pretty good, but it's maybe a little too strong on the opacity here. So let's bump that down to maybe 15% or 20%. I think 15% is enough to make it stand off the page, but it's not distracting in how strong it looks. So I think I'm going to go with that. So again, selecting that plate, let's add an effect style. This will be elevation 1 for the light theme. And with that taken care of, we're well on our way to establishing the inbox of our design. So if we take a look here at our target design that we've recreated, in the next episode, I think we'll establish the message list itself. So that way we can have a flexible number of messages being shown depending on viewport size and the mockup that we're going for. And then we'll move on to adding in the components of the header for this layout area to get this whole inbox section finalized. So we're going to end things here for this episode. Thank you so much for watching, and be sure to look out for the next video coming out soon.